The voice of America was Walter Cronkite. JFK was the most adored president in the country. They appeared to be allies on film. They were always at odds behind the scenes. Once after shooting was over, Kennedy attempted to cancel an interview. He presented Cronkite's case to the network executives. Enraged, Cronkite barged into Kennedy's hotel room. The president prioritized appearance above content. The reporters saw it all. Their covert conflicts remained undisclosed for decades. We now disclose the true events that transpired between two American giants. In 1916, Walter Cronkite was born in Missouri. He was the lone child. He had a dentist for a father. His mom remained in the house. He always called Kansas City home, even when they relocated to Houston and subsequently Kansas City. Walter was inquisitive as a child. He studied encyclopedias, maintained journals, and asked questions that no one else had. He participated in student government, edited the school newspaper, and even took home a state journalism prize while he was in high school. Because his parents were having financial difficulties, he also took on odd jobs. In 1933, he enrolled in the University of Texas, but left 2 years later to pursue a full-time job in journalism. He joined United Press in 1937. Things really got off from there. He was one of just 8 combat correspondents who trained with the military during World War II. He reported from the front lines of the Battle of the Bulge in Normandy, and he went on bombing sorties over Germany. He became the Moscow bureau chief after the war, and assisted in establishing bureaus around Europe. He became the man who would be referred to as America's most trusted voice as a result of all that happened to him during those years. The world in which John F. Kennedy was born was a very different one. He possessed familial ties, wealth, and influence, but before he could speak, his body was collapsing. He was often ill. Infinite infections, gastrointestinal issues, and scarlet fever. In his teens, his weight became dangerously low. Doctors were unable to determine the cause. He was later diagnosed with colitis, but celiac disease was probably the cause. He experimented with various therapies, such as placing pellets beneath his skin, that caused him weak bones, but it also helped a little. He was eventually diagnosed with Addison's illness in 1947 when he was in England. In 1954, a bone in his back collapsed, making matters worse. Crutches were necessary for him. He was hurting all the time. He informed his father that he would sooner die than live that way after undergoing dangerous spine surgery. Nevertheless, he managed to become a war hero. His boat was hit by a Japanese warship in 1943. With a strap clasped between his teeth, Kennedy swam for 5 hours, carrying an injured crewman. He would never forget that moment. He was frail, ill, and in constant agony, yet he was also unbelievably brave. Something new occurred in American politics. In 1960, people were paying attention to more than just presidential debates for the first time. On TV, they were watching them. Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy squared off in front of millions of viewers. Walter Cronkite was in the midst of a silent tug-of-war that was taking on behind the scenes long before the cameras rolled. Cronkite had scheduled a number of interviews with both candidates for CBS. He aimed to be impartial. He was aware that the first person to go may be at a disadvantage. He then asked Nixon whether he was comfortable taking the lead. Nixon made no hesitation. "That's okay," he said. "It's just fine." However, tensions increased when Cronkite told Kennedy. He was not believed by Kennedy. He yelled, "He hasn't agreed to it. Tell me what." Although it was a brief instance, it revealed something greater. Kennedy was wary, perhaps even skeptical, but he was also picking things up fast. Kennedy eventually consented to the interview, but he wasn't pleased with how it came out. He felt that his performance was lacking. He instructed CBS to terminate it immediately after filming concluded. After that, he phoned the network executives and went around Cronkite. He desired to completely remodel it. Cronkite was incensed. Kennedy was sleeping on his back with his speechwriter when he stormed up to his room. Cronkite did not scream out. He struck a bargain. Kennedy had the option to retake the interview, but CBS would display a notice stating that it was his second attempt. Kennedy was really stunned by that. He was aware of how that would appear, so he caved. He gave them permission to broadcast the original, uncut interview. Kennedy was altered by that moment. He became aware of TV's true power. He began to get ready like never before. He prepared his responses, committed information to memory, and worked on maintaining composure. The cameras, however, were not taken seriously by Nixon. He blended in with the surroundings because to his light outfit, he didn't wear cosmetics. He appeared pale, worn out, and sweating under the intense studio lights. Kennedy appeared powerful and self-assured in a black suit in ideal lighting. The mayor of Chicago remarked, "My God, they embalmed him before he even died," when he saw Nixon on TV. Kennedy was proficient in the use of television. He got it down pat by the third debate. Like he was speaking to you, he could address the camera directly. Even when he prepared every phrase, he still came across as natural. Nixon was in Los Angeles, while Kennedy was in New York on October 13th. It made no difference if they were arguing from separate cities. Kennedy talked easily and looked directly into the lens. He made it sound easy and straightforward as he discussed international affairs and the Chinese islands of Matsu and Quemoy. Cronkite, later, who watched it all, claimed that the arguments were a game-changer. This type of politics was novel. However, Cronkite's perspective changed once Kennedy was elected. Kennedy appeared heroic on television. Cronkite believed he was someone else off camera. Cronkite subsequently described it as being extremely self-centered, almost to the extent of egotism. He saw that Kennedy struggled to cooperate with Congress. The speed at which he rose to power angered many MPs. He didn't deserve it, in their opinion. Kennedy didn't make things any simpler either. He had trouble passing stuff. Many of his major proposals were only passed into legislation after his passing. His foreign policy appeared unsteady as well. Kennedy stated in one interview that this must be the Vietnam War. They must realize that this cannot be our battle. Later on, though, he took the opposite action. He dispatched additional soldiers. He turned it into an American war. Cronkite had no trouble recalling it. He believed that Kennedy's words and deeds were inconsistent. The majority of Americans, however, were blind to that aspect. On the evening news, Cronkite showed them the Kennedy. Young, self-assured, attractive. The man who defeated Nixon not with superior ideas, but with superior lighting. The man who won the debate by being prepared. Cooler faces under strain and sharper suits. Despite his prior exposure to political deception, Walter Cronkite was unprepared for what transpired in April 1961. At that point, Cronkite would never forget the Bay of Pigs invasion, which turned out to be one of the United States' worst foreign policy blunders. The intended attack was previously known to reporters at the New York Times and CBS. Cuban exiles trained by the United States were getting ready to land and remove Fidel Castro. However, they were instructed to keep silent by the Kennedy administration. They said it was a national security issue. Later, Cronkite referred to it as a patriotic plea. The Times retreated. CBS did the same, and the scheme could have advanced as a result of that quiet. Kennedy said years later that we might not have visited the Bay of Pigs if the New York Times had published that. The invasion didn't work out. Castro's army was prepared. The assailants were either apprehended or slain. Cronkite claimed that it severely hurt the young president, who was still getting used to his new role, and that it destroyed any possibility of peace between Cuba and the United States. Kennedy took another action a year later, but in private this time. The New York Times ran a front-page item on July 26, 1962. The Soviets were reportedly constructing concrete coverings for their missile launch locations. The paper also revealed the true views captured by U.S. surveillance cameras. Robert Kennedy ordered the FBI to begin tapping phones the same day. First, a Times office secretary. Next, the New York residence of the reporter. This soon becomes something far larger. Kennedy and CIA Director John McCone met on August 22, a month later. He instructed him to start monitoring journalists. Despite being prohibited from spying within the United States, the CIA continued to do so. The project was dubbed Project Mockingbird. Every senior employee who has access to secret material was instructed to document all of their communications with the media. Documents pertaining to the operation were made public in 2007, some years later. Kennedy attempted to do the same with the CIA long before Nixon established his own leak-stopping team, according to the New York Times. The initiative, which targeted journalists nationwide, ran until 1965. Famous columnists like Paul Scott and Robert S. Allen were among them. It gave future presidents a bad example. From the beginning, Cronkite's relationship with Kennedy was complex. Cronkite recounted in one interview how Kennedy once griped about sitting on a plush sofa during a television appearance. Kennedy claimed it gave him a weak, unpresidential appearance. Cronkite was taken aback. He believed that the president was more focused on looks than on content. Additionally, he saw that Kennedy frequently responded before a question was completed. Cronkite claimed it was likely due to Kennedy's quick thinking, but it still irritated him. Additionally, he disapproved of the president's media dominance. CBS and others only received fragments of the report during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The White House was the source of everything. It was one-sided, censored, and controlled. There was so much going on behind the scenes that reporters were never able to witness it, Cronkite subsequently stated. He carried that strain with him during Kennedy's presidency. But none of this was ever seen by the general population. They witnessed a young, powerful leader. They were unaware that Kennedy was engaged in a vicious internal conflict. The president was using a variety of medicines during the critical October days of the missile crisis. He used steroids like hydrocortisone, testosterone, to treat his adrenal issues, antispasmodics for colitis, and antibiotics for a urinary tract infection. He took painkillers, tranquilizers like Librio, sleeping drugs, amphetamines like Ritalin, and salt tablets to maintain his equilibrium. He was a walking pharmacy on paper. Kennedy was in excruciating anguish behind closed doors, particularly from his back, which had sustained injuries years before. That was probably exacerbated by some of the medicines he used. Addison's illness was one of the conditions that was discussed. Kennedy stated that someone with the actual Addison's illness should run for president, but I don't have it, in response to a direct question from historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 1959. In a technical sense, he was being honest. In its original definition, Addison's disease had to be associated with adrenal gland tuberculosis. Kennedy didn't have it, although he did require ongoing steroid medication to function due to adrenal insufficiency. His bones, particularly his spine, most likely weakened as a result of the treatment. Something happened on November 22, 1963, that permanently altered television. The time was 1:40 p.m. on the East Coast when a news report was broadcast by CBS, interrupting a soap opera. President John F. Kennedy had been shot at in Dallas 10 minutes prior. However, it wasn't as easy as turning on a camera back then. It took the studio cameras at least 20 minutes to warm up. Thus, America's most dependable voice, Walter Cronkite, had to go live using only his voice. No image. Just voice over a dark screen that said, CBS News Bulletin, with no face. Despite the pandemonium going on behind the scenes, Cronkite spoke calmly to those at home. He went through the first, second, and third bulletins. Shots were fired first. Kennedy had then been struck. Lastly, there have been rumors that the president may have passed away. Cronkite did not, however, state that it was official. He refrained. He waited. The cameras eventually went on around 2 p.m. Cronkite looked nervous and breathless when he first appeared on TV without his jacket, but he continued. He gave the country an update for over an hour without allowing emotion to get in the way. Then, everything changed at precisely 2:38 p.m. Cronkite read the lines from the Associated Press wire while glancing at the camera. Apparently official, the flash is from Dallas, Texas. At 1 p.m., President Kennedy passed away, Central Standard Time. About 38 minutes ago, he remarked, glancing at the clock. He then removed his spectacles, cleared his throat, and blinked. His voice broke momentarily. It was viewed by millions of Americans. It was breaking for the calmest man on TV. The entire nation learned that it was okay to feel anything during that brief, hardly noticeable pause. Cronkite continued over the following 4 days. He was on the radio for about 72 hours. He led the country through a period of shock, sorrow, and bewilderment. Reporting was no longer enough. In real time, history was being written. There was continuous coverage on all three major networks. People from all throughout the nation watched together. Together they grieved. Together they looked for purpose. Cronkite also developed into more than just a reporter. He turned into a reflection of the American spirit. "Only history can chronicle the significance of this day," he remarked gently to the camera on the eve of Kennedy's burial. He questioned whether there was any chance that this gloomy time might give way to a dawn of insight. He then added something more profound, something that people found memorable. "It's unlikely that many Americans will sleep tonight without feeling like they've failed in some way." Kennedy's legacy was shaped by his remarks, not just as a man but also as a symbol of unfulfilled promise. Cronkite, meanwhile, was having difficulties behind the scenes. He was worn out and caught between his humanity and his role as a reporter. He wanted to weep, but he refrained from doing so. For everyone to see, he managed to keep it together. Others broke. Chet Huntley of NBC was visibly furious. Cronkite remained composed as ABC's Ron Cochran trembled while speaking. He took his time, even after CBS received preliminary news that Kennedy had passed away. Dan Rather was certain. It had previously been stated by CBS Radio. Cronkite, however, waited. "These are just reports," he repeated. It wasn't until The Wire made the formal announcement. Even then, he claimed, it was ostensibly official. Apparently just one word revealed who he was. Walter Cronkite had witnessed everything. He saw Kennedy's ascent, and he was present when everything fell apart. However, Cronkite subtly raised an eyebrow years later when JFK was still being portrayed as a saint. He stated it clearly in one interview with CBS. Kennedy's ability to cooperate with Congress was lacking. The majority of his most important laws, once he was gone, they were passed. It wasn't magic. The person pulling the ropes was Lyndon B. Johnson. Looking directly into the camera, Johnson declared that the Civil Rights Act was Kennedy's dream when he signed it into law in 1964. However, the majority of specialists concurred that bill may have passed away on the floor if JFK had been alive. Johnson didn't merely force it. He destroyed it by bulldozing it. And it was only the start. Johnson enacted 200 significant legislation in the next 2 years. This covered financing for education, Medicare, Medicaid, and even environmental safeguards. Having a front-row seat to Washington, Cronkite was aware of the true situation. Johnson was giving the nation's grief impetus. The credit went to Kennedy. The results were sent to Johnson. However, not all power changes were seamless. On the 27th of February 1968, Cronkite took a plane to Vietnam. After witnessing the mayhem of the Tet Offensive, he returned with a decision that stunned the country. America, he claimed, was at a standstill. It was hard coming from Cronkite. According to reports, Johnson stated, "I've lost Middle America if I've lost Cronkite." However, behind it lay a more significant paradox. Kennedy had followed a very different course only a few years prior. He signed INSAM 263, a document outlining intentions to withdraw 1,000 troops from Vietnam by the end of that year, in October 1963. By 1965, he even gave his approval for a complete departure. He also had no intention of waiting for a win. Win or lose, that was the strategy. However, the scheme was abandoned following his murder. Johnson took over. Furthermore, by 1965, the U.S. was actively engaged in combat rather than only offering advice. By the conclusion of that year, there were 185,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Kennedy began with 16,000. Johnson made it into a conflict. Therefore, when Cronkite referred to it as a stalemate, it was a reminder of what could have been rather than simply the combat. Then there were Cronkite's omitted remarks. Despite being the most trusted newsman in America, he kept the public in the dark about Kennedy's affairs, particularly the ones surrounding Marilyn Monroe. Of course he knew. In the press circles, everyone did. Rumors circulated about spending a covert weekend at Bing Crosby's home with Monroe. A phone conversation that Monroe purportedly made to Jackie Kennedy was recorded, the notorious time she sang "Happy Birthday" while wearing a frock that appeared to have been painted on. Jackie didn't go at all that night. Instead, she attended a barbecue. According to some reports, Monroe believed the connection to be serious. Cronkite said nothing. Whether it was or not, back then that was the norm. Regardless of how sensational the news was, you didn't cover the president's personal life. Kennedy's reputation therefore remained untarnished, at least in public. Cronkite, however, was not blind, and as time went on, the uncertainty became apparent. He started to question whether he had contributed to the development of an unauthentic Kennedy. He claimed in a different interview that Kennedy was extremely egotistical and self-centered. That's a far cry from the idea of Camelot that was peddled to Americans. The voice of those 4 gloomy days in November 1963 had been Cronkite. When Kennedy passed away, his serene voice informed the country. He removed his spectacles. His gaze fell. That moment is remembered by millions. He concluded his 4-day report by stating that perhaps Kennedy's passing would unite Americans. Walter Cronkite broadcast a dangerous 2-part program about the Watergate crisis in October 1972. Few members of the media at the time were paying much attention to it. Cronkite, however, did. He covered it for 22 minutes on CBS in prime time. Everything changed with that choice. It brought the story to the attention of the country. Even Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, later stated that after Cronkite covered it, people began to take notice. It was a turning point, he said. Cronkite received an Emmy for that report. It meant more to him than any other award he had ever received, and he dubbed it the Big Doozy. However, something more profound was also taking place. Cronkite was different. He had changed from being a newsman who valued image and charm. He was now more concerned with substance and facts, and holding those in positions of authority accountable, something he acknowledged he didn't always do when John F. Kennedy was president. A Reporter's Life, Cronkite's memoir, was published years later. It was no ordinary book. It was shocking. In it he at last revealed the true nature of JFK's inner life. Kennedy had always been regarded by the world as charismatic, shrewd and smooth. Cronkite, however, presented an alternative image. He claimed that Kennedy was extremely self-centered, egotistical and confident. He was the type of person who needed to be in charge and didn't get along with Congress at all. Kennedy's public persona had always been one of leadership and accomplishing goals, so that final point was crucial. Cronkite did, however, disclose that the majority of JFK's significant legislation was enacted after his passing. Cronkite had assisted in the sale of the phony image. His autobiography was more than a retrospective. It was an admission. He acknowledged that he and the press had contributed to the creation of the Camelot myth. Cronkite then took it a step further in 2003, 40 years after Kennedy was assassinated. He repeated it while staring directly at the camera on CBS's The Early Show. JFK was quite selfish. People were stunned. When he announced Kennedy's death, this was the same man who had previously coughed on air. His voice had broken. He had removed his spectacles, and the entire nation had joined him in tears at that time. He was no longer scared to tell the truth, though. He did not, however, totally discredit Kennedy. He praised him for his resilience throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cronkite claimed that would be his best moment. It restored people's trust in him. But what about the others? Not at all. He said that prior to that, Kennedy had not accomplished much and that he found it difficult to lead Congress. These were sincere observations honed by time, not merely resentful remarks from an elderly guy. Ultimately, Cronkite and Kennedy's relationship was far more complicated than most people knew. More was disclosed in a Douglas Brinkley biography of Cronkite. It revealed that despite his claims of journalistic objectivity, Cronkite maintained close relationships with influential individuals, particularly the Kennedys. He even collaborated closely with Bobby Kennedy during his presidential campaign at one time. Today, such closeness would be considered scandalous. In exchange for Cronkite's access, the Kennedys received favorable press. According to the book, Cronkite's greatest ethical transgression was not just his prejudice, but also his pretense of not having any. That's why his subsequent candor was so potent. Not only did his eventual admission that JFK wasn't the hero everyone thought he was, but it also rocked his own legacy. After decades of concealing the truth, recently made public CIA papers reveal something that should shock everyone. The CIA never acknowledged how much they knew about Lee Harvey Oswald. They also didn't remain silent. They repeatedly told lies. It began in November of 1959. Oswald switched to the Soviet Union at that point.